10 years ago, I decided I had enough. I booked a one-way ticket overseas with only $2,000 in my wallet and decided I was going to figure out a way to escape the rat race forever. This is the story of how. 2012, America. This was a very interesting time to be alive. A 5,000-year cycle in the Mayan calendar was set to end on December 21st, and as a result, a lot of people thought the world was going to end on that day. There was even a movie, 2012, that depicted this pretty epically. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on who you ask, December 21st, 2012, came and went like any other day. Nothing eventful happened at all. I woke up the morning of December 22nd, and personally, I was just a little disappointed the world didn't end. The economy was completely screwed just as it is now, and despite applying over 200 times, it was impossible to find a job. My boomer parents, being the typical delusional boomers they are, thought it'd be a good idea to kick me out in midst of the Great Recession. I had done various gigs and odd jobs here and there to get by, but this month, my luck ran out. I would spend the holiday season worrying about getting evicted, as I had only a few days to figure out how I would come up with rent money for January. I scoured the internet for every imaginable possibility, even for things that would sacrifice my dignity. I was desperate. Eventually, I stumbled upon something. A Craigslist ad for a clinical trial paying $1,000. I went to the facility where I had to sign a waiver. I accept the risk that I could suffer serious injury or even death. Under normal conditions, I would never have done it, but the economy was so screwed that I had no other choice. Thankfully, the clinical trial actually went quite smooth. They performed 20 blood draws on me throughout the day, which was rather annoying and painful. But I literally had no side effects from the test drug itself, and I got out relatively unscathed. There was another major occurrence going on in the year 2012, the presidential election. Obama was running against Republican challenger Mitt Romney, and both of them were claiming they could fix the economy. Obama represented a lot of hope and change for us millennials. But at that point, a cold dose of reality had dawned on me. The economy was screwed and America was finished. No politician, Democrat or Republican, was going to be able to save us. I realized the only way to survive would be to leave America for good. It was at that point I started to hatch up my game plan. I would spend the next 6 months doing as many clinical trials as I could, so that I could save up enough money to leave. In the meantime, I moved out of my apartment and negotiated a deal with a friend where I would take care of his house in exchange for a reduced rate on rent. I found a church where every Wednesday and Sunday they had food drives, so I would stock up food for the week and get to save even more. After 6 months of clinical trials and more blood draws than I could count, I finally saved up $2,000. To be fair to my boomer parents, they were more supportive of my idea of moving abroad than I expected, and they were getting increasingly concerned about all the clinical trials I was doing. So they agreed to pay for my one-way plane ticket to Europe, and off I went. I had nothing but $2,000, a suitcase, and some blind faith that I'd figure out a way to make it work. My first stop in Europe was Romania, a country that I have fond memories of to this day. In my senior year of high school, I did a presentation on Romania for my geography class, and since then I was always curious about it. I did some research on the internet, and it checked every box I was looking for. It was cheap, relatively safe, good food, fast internet, and of course the girls were hot. Hey, what can I say? This was before modern dating became so fucked. After a 48-hour journey with a 24 layover in Moscow, I arrived at the Otopeni airport in Bucharest, and I instantly felt the trauma of America lifted off my shoulders. I went to the grocery store in the airport and got myself a fresh sandwich and chocolate bar for just 8 Romanian lei, or about $2. I could instantly and immediately taste the freshness and lack of preservatives in the food. It was at this moment I decided I was never going back to America. I found a youth hostel in Bucharest that cost only $7 per night. Though I had escaped the nightmarish living expenses of America, I was still operating on very limited funds and had to stretch it out as long as humanly possible. I took a stroll around the Bucharest Old Town. It was beautiful. The Renaissance-style architecture absolutely captivated me, as I had never seen anything like that in America. I met a cool group of friends from Scotland at the hostel, and we all went for an epic guys' night out. We bought a lot of drinks, ate at a pretty fancy restaurant, went to a nice club and partied. All luxury expenses that I could never dream of in the States. I woke up the next day, pretty hungover, expecting that my bank account would be absolutely ruined, but to my surprise, the whole night only cost me about $30. That was incredible in and of itself, but I realized going forward I would have to be more financially disciplined. Going forward, I would spend my days eating cheap strudels and pastries from the food carts in Bucharest. I could eat a solid 3 meals a day for between $3 to $5 total. When you consider the hostel only costs $7 a night, that was literally cheaper than my rent in America, and I was able to actually live off $10 to $12 a day. The youth hostel itself was also an incredible social environment, as I met new people from all over the world on a daily basis. This was a great experience that I wouldn't trade for anything, but let's just say it wasn't so great for my finances. After staying there for a month or so, my funds had dwindled to around $1,500. So once again, I had to figure something out. I struck up a conversation with a young Mexican kid who was working reception at the hostel. I was just curious how he got the job, and he told me to just Google hostel volunteer work and see what comes up. Ideally, I would have liked to just volunteer at that very hostel in Bucharest, but unfortunately, they were fully staffed. So once again, it was time to take to the internet. I Googled hostel volunteer work as he suggested, and I found an opening in Tallinn, Estonia. I applied, and unlike the hellacious job market in America, they didn't ask for 1 billion qualifications and 50 years experience. They just said, come on over. Thankfully, with Ryanair, you can get relatively cheap flights around Europe. So I found a ticket for $75 to Tallinn, and once again, it was time to take to the skies. I landed in Estonia, and by now, it was early wintertime, so it was a completely different landscape than Romania. Estonia is absolutely freezing and covered in snow during the winter. But it's kind of cool as it gives the city a bit of a winter fairy tale vibe. I had a bit of apprehension going in, however, this would be the first time since I was 18 that I would be working for a boss. Every boss I worked for in America was such a snot-nosed, unbearable boomer that left a really sour taste in my mouth. Fortunately, the second I arrived at the hostel, I instantly saw that this wouldn't be the case here. My boss was a super chill Spanish guy who happened to be a huge NBA fan like me, and he shared my frustrations that people in Europe tend to watch soccer or football. For you Europeans out there more, I instantly became a valuable volunteer for him sheerly, due to the fact that we both watched the NBA. In Estonia, I really managed to cut down on my expenses. The hostel offered a free all-you-can-eat breakfast for both guests and volunteers, so I would stuff myself with as much oatmeal and cereal as I could every morning, so that I would have to eat less later in the day when I would actually have to pay for it. My finances were starting to dwindle down towards $1,000 at that point, and that was starting to get scary. I met an Italian friend around my age there, and he was in the same boat as me. The Italian economy was just as screwed as the American one. So he taught me how to cook cheap Italian pastas that were still delicious. And because we were both desperately trying to save money, we would both eat a big breakfast, skip lunch, and split the groceries for a cheap but delicious Italian pasta in the evening for dinner. Surprisingly, despite all the carbs, we didn't get that out of shape as the Tallinn Old Town was beautiful, and we'd spend a lot of our days just aimlessly wandering around it. I spent a solid 2.5 months volunteering in the Tallinn hostel, and despite the extreme shoestring budget of $3 to $5 per day I was living on, I still look back on this as one of the happiest times of my life. I made so many friends from all over the world, and got to live in the center of one of the most beautiful old towns in Europe. It just didn't feel like living in poverty in America. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. Americans are only allowed to stay in Europe without a visa for 90 out of 180 days. Or to think of it more simply, 3 out of every 6 months. My visa free stay was expiring, and soon I would have to leave the EU for at least 3 months. Thankfully, back then, there was a really interesting loophole I found to get around this. The EU and Schengen zone are two different things. Both represent the union of the EU, but it works a bit differently when it comes to traveling. The Schengen zone is the area where there are no borders between European countries. You can travel freely between them, and this is where the 90-day restriction applies. Now, back when I was traveling, Romania and Bulgaria were not yet part of the Schengen zone, which meant that I could leave Estonia and go back to Romania for 3 months to reset my visa. Now, unfortunately, as of March 31st this year, Romania officially became a member of Schengen, so this loophole would no longer work today. But there are still other ways to navigate this if you want to travel today. I'll cover that a bit more in my travel guide video that's coming soon. With about $1,000 left, it was time to say goodbye to my friends in Tallinn and go back to Romania once more. I landed in Otopeni Bucharest airport again, but this time my situation was urgent. I was down to under $1,000 and panic started to set in. I couldn't volunteer since every hostel in Romania seemed fully staffed, so I had to pinch every penny. I realized Bucharest, being Romania's biggest city, might not be the cheapest place to stay. When I returned to the hostel I'd stayed at before, the old volunteers remembered me and welcomed me back very nicely. I asked for recommendations on other Romanian cities, and they all gave one unanimous answer: Brasov. A week later, I booked a train ticket to Brasov and saw why everyone loved it. I've traveled to over 25 countries, and to this day, Brasov remains my favorite city ever. A stunning old town, breathtaking mountain views, and a peaceful atmosphere. I found a cozy hostel for $7 a night, and with my new skill of cooking cheap Italian pasta, I spent only $3 to $5 a day on food. I calculated that if I was disciplined, I could live on just $10 a day. Inspired by Elon Musk's experiment of living on $1 a day, I embraced this frugality. But I realized no matter how much I saved, I couldn't cut expenses to zero. Eventually, I'd run out of funds. This was long before remote work became mainstream, so I had no idea what to do. With around $900 left, I figured I had about 3 months to figure something out. 2 weeks later, I met a Slovakian guy at the hostel who was living well, traveling while working online as a programmer. He suggested I try it, but after a few online courses, I knew programming wasn't for me. However, it did introduce me to the idea of remote work. I found a tutoring app called Nice Talk, applied, and got accepted. Teaching English online paid $10 an hour, which was enough to cover a day's expenses. I caught another break when I met a local Romanian girl who told me she was about to do some traveling herself soon. When I explained my situation, she offered to let me stay in her apartment, to look after it while she was gone. This was exactly what I needed. This gave me a private space to tutor without distractions, and so I worked up to 8 hours a day. After 2 months, I managed to save up $1,000, bringing my total back to $1,500, which felt like a huge relief. Now, you remember that pesky 90-day rule about being in the EU Schengen zone? Unfortunately, the same thing applies to Romania. As a US citizen, you can only stay there for 3 out of 6 months. So, just as my 3 months expired in Estonia, which forced me back to Romania, my 3 months in Romania was set to expire now and I would have to go back to the EU. This wasn't such a bad thing on paper. In fact, it was great that all of Europe was once again opening up to me. But at this point in my travels, all the airports and hostels and train rides were starting to tire me out. As much as I enjoyed the social life and constantly meeting new people, it was also nice to just live, eat, and sleep in the same comfortable apartment for 2 months straight. Such is life, though, and the alternative, once again, was to go back to the corporate hellscape of America. I graciously thanked the Romanian girl, who was so kind to help me out, and I was on my way back to the EU. My initial plan was to go back to my old Tallinn hostel. I got along really well with my boss there, and he told me when I left that I was welcome back at any time. Unfortunately, he had left that hostel for a better career by that point, and the new manager said they were fully staffed, so I had to look elsewhere. I then found an opportunity to volunteer at a youth summer camp in Lithuania, and this one not only gave you free accommodation, but 3 free meals per day as well. Out of the many volunteering gigs I've done in my life, this one would turn out to be by far my favorite experience. By this time, it was the later 2010s, and the oldest members of Gen Z were just starting to come of age. Millennials were still the predominant young adults at the time, and I really didn't even know the term Gen Z even existed yet. I really didn't know what to expect, because I remember how I was as a teenager, and I definitely would have not enjoyed being a summer camp leader for myself. To my surprise, however, these kids and T-Angers were all incredibly smart, mature, and thoughtful. The biggest surprise to me was that when I told them my life story of giving up the traditional path for traveling and volunteering, they actually thought it was the coolest thing ever, and they wanted to try it too. This was a huge breath of fresh air, as anytime I talked to a boomer or even fellow millennial about my lifestyle choices, they'd always look at me sideways about it, and I'd constantly be having to stand my ground and fight back. You could say this was the beginning of the seeds that sparked my inspiration in the younger generation and led to me starting this YouTube channel today. Okay, so this insane story is nearing its conclusion now. After the summer ended and the volunteering gig was up, I managed to find a cheap guest house in a Lithuanian city for just $12 a night. This was an incredible price for a private room. I mean, hell, this adds up to $360 a month, which is like 1/10 the monthly rent of an apartment in New York City that you have to sign a 1-year lease and pay an entire extra month deposit for. This allowed me to continue my online English tutoring job and even save up some money while at it. Eventually, I was able to find my own clients outside of the app and make even more money. I no longer had the stamina to sustain a $10 a day daily budget, however. That was just mental. I still have no idea how I did it when I look back on it today. I realistically began to spend $20 to $25 per day, which still wasn't bad, and with my extra clients now, I was able to save back up to my initial $2,000. In the very late 2010s, right before the pandemic hit, my luck finally turned around. After getting screwed financially my whole adult life starting with the 2008 financial crash, I made some timely investments in crypto and in the stock market, which really took off in 2020. That is when I would say I finally achieved financial stability, and not only got out, but stayed out of America for good. This was my personal story on how I moved abroad with only $2,000 in my pocket. Keep in mind, this is how I did it, and not necessarily how you should do it. The purpose of this video is to just give you guys a blueprint and a rough idea of what's possible if you have the courage to take a leap of faith. A lot has changed since I last traveled. For example, the fact that Romania officially joined Schengen now. So I've made an updated travel video guide that's coming out next weekend right here on this channel. You're going to want to tune into this one as it's much more relevant to today. Think of it this way. Today's video was more about how I did it, but tomorrow's video will be from the perspective of how I would travel if I were just starting as a young man today, in 2024. But perhaps after watching this, you're only just starting to consider moving abroad yourself, in which case, check out this video right here.